So hello my friends, Devaun Lennox here, PhotographyPX. In today's video I want to show you the best settings for the Fujifilm X-T200 for both photos and video. This is definitely going to be oriented towards beginners, but I'm not going to explain every single one of the settings in the menu in a very detailed way. I'm going to give you a brief overview of a lot of the settings and some best practices, but I will be skipping over some elements throughout this video that I don't feel that are totally necessary from a beginner's perspective. But you can also find timestamps in the description box down below if you want to skip to a more relevant section. I will break this video into both photo and video separately, and we'll go through the menu bit by bit, starting with photography. But let's get started with the setup guide. So first and foremost, let's head over to the X-T200 and jump into the menu, and we're going to be greeted with the image quality settings guide. Here in the image quality settings guide, you're going to be configuring your image quality settings for photos. This is going to include your JPEG or RAW sizes, resolutions, and some other settings related to taking images. First and foremost, we're going to start with image size. This is going to determine the JPEG images the camera is going to be capturing. You can set this to a variety of different frames. I shoot in 1:1 because I shoot for the Instagram crop. I don't actually leave it at 1:1. I actually go to 8.5:11 in editing in Lightroom when I'm exporting my photos. But I shoot in camera JPEG plus RAW, and I actually do 1:1 because it allows me to get tighter framing so that I actually have more room to crop in post-processing and have more room when I'm actually outputting to social media. But here you're going to be able to change the size of your images. I would recommend, if you're shooting JPEGs only, to actually use this large size up here and then change this accordingly. By default, it's going to be set to 4:3, but you can change that accordingly. Like I was mentioning, I do 1:1 personally. The next setting that's going to be in this menu besides image size is going to be image quality. Here you can choose between fine or raw. If you're going to be shooting JPEGs, the best quality setting is going to be fine. Now, if you're going to be shooting JPEG and RAW, then I would recommend using fine plus RAW. That's going to give you a combination of both JPEG and RAW, and which is going to be great because if you connect this camera, the SD card, to a computer, you can actually preview the JPEG files without having to import them into Lightroom. Otherwise, you're just going to see .raf, and it doesn't actually work on macOS Catalina. So unfortunately, you're going to have to import them to a cataloging software to actually see these raw files. The next thing is going to be film simulation. This is going to be based on how you're shooting. Film simulations are basically historic film profiles that replicate Fujifilm's film stock that they've had over their last, I don't even remember, I think it's like 40 or 50 years that they've been in business. And these are just the historic color profiles that they've created based on some of their most famous Fujifilm film stocks that you can actually get, and you can get like Porta 400 or those kind of actual films. The next thing is going to be the portrait enhancer that's in live view. Portrait enhancer is basically a soft skin effect that basically smooths, it kind of smooths the skin tones, and it does that by essentially adding kind of a little bit of blur. And it does that specifically by using the face and eye detection, so it knows where the face of the subject is, and then it applies that blur selectively based on it recognizing eyes, and then it applies it most of the cheek to remove blemishes. You can turn on the portrait and enhance it if you like. If you're doing a lot of vlogs and you have a lot of blemishes, I would encourage you turning that option on. It will definitely help you. Dynamic range is never something I change. I always leave it at 100%. You can change this particular thing if you'd want. White balance, this is going to be dependent on where you're shooting. By default, I just set it to auto white balance, or I set it to custom, and I actually do a custom white balance, or I set it to Kelvin and I do a custom white balance there. Highlight tone, shadow tone, color sharpness, noise reduction. These are settings I always leave at 0. Essentially what's happening is when you change these, you're changing the JPEG rendering of how the camera is going to be outputting its JPEGs. That doesn't include how it's going to add the film simulations as well. I just leave this as 0 because I want the JPEGs to just be completely as close to the raw files as possible. So I never change this on any camera. I don't want them to be over sharpened. I don't want them to be under sharpened. I don't want there to be more shadows to increase the shadows. I don't want the highlights to be pushed down. If you're shooting strictly JPEG and you want to do everything in camera, this will be something to experiment with, because you'll get images that are more true to your style right in camera, and you don't have to go into post-processing to make these kind of adjustments. So it's something you can experiment with, and you can definitely set up a stage and shoot an object, and you can play around with these sliders if you like, and you can kind of adjust those, but it's not something I do. I always just edit in post-processing. Noise reduction, this is also something I always set at standard. You can turn this down to low. I just leave it on standard. This is applying noise reduction to the JPEGs. It doesn't really do that for raw images. This is specifically for JPEG images, but you can add noise reduction on the JPEGs if you'd like, or you can do that in post-processing. Long exposure noise reduction, this is also going to be when you're doing JPEGs. It's basically going to add noise reduction to long exposures, somewhere in maybe the 5 second to 10 second, 30 second long exposure range. And it's going to add noise reduction to reduce any kind of noise when you're shooting outside at night. Color space, it's up to you if you want to do sRGB or Adobe RGB. These days I've been doing sRGB because honestly I've just been posting to social media and these kind of platforms, and most people are not going to be able to see the extra wide color gamut of Adobe RGB. My monitor can see Adobe RGB, but since my entire workflow is not going to be Adobe RGB until I start really heavily printing, it's not going to be something I'm going to set in camera. But otherwise, if you're going to be printing, I would encourage that you use Adobe RGB if you have a monitor that's calibrated that actually supports Adobe RGB, just because you'll be able to see more colors, and then you can output your file to sRGB and you can reduce the colors when you're exporting. But otherwise, I just kind of leave this to sRGB personally. The next menu setting that we're going to go into is going to be our autofocus and manual focus selections. Here you're going to be able to customize the camera's focusing and tracking to your specific mediums and how you shoot and what you're shooting at that moment. So first and foremost is going to be the focusing area. Essentially here you're going to have I think it's like a 90 point grid or something like that. It's 80 to 100, it's somewhere in that range point grid. I do have the 1x1 on right now, so you're not going to see the full grid because it's cropping into the display. But essentially this is going to allow you to pick your focusing point. I'm going to go back into the menu and we're going to go into the focusing mode. Let me go back. So we're going to go down here. The focusing mode is going to be how you're going to select single autofocus, continuous, or manual focus. For me, I usually use single autofocus if I'm taking photos, and I use the center point, or I use the back joystick and I put it over my subject, and I either recompose or I just leave it there depending on what I'm shooting. Sometimes I will recompose and I'll just leave the centermost point and I will recompose, just because I've been shooting. I'm a little bit old school. I've been shooting for a while, so I do like focus recomposing. I find that's a little bit more accurate. But the next thing outside of that is going to be your autofocusing mode. Here you're going to select from single point, zone, wide, or full tracking. In general, if I'm taking photos, I do usually use single point, and I specifically target where I want people their attention to go, especially if I'm shooting at wide open at f2 or so. If I'm shooting wide open and I really have a blurry background and a lot of separation between the subject and everything else just kind of fading out, then I will use single point. Outside of that, like if I'm shooting inside in the studio, I will use zone. Zone is basically a cluster or group of somewhere between 9 to 12 to, depends on the size, to maybe 30 points. It's in a grid shape and you can kind of move it around on screen. Zone allows you to basically select a cluster of autofocusing points that are then going to work together, and it's going to pick the one that has the most amount of contrast, essentially what happens. And it picks that one, so it gets you the fastest autofocusing response in the area that you want the camera to focus. Wide and tracking is a little bit more of an autofocusing selection that I would use if I'm doing movement, I'm shooting dance, I'm shooting action in sports, I'm shooting a moving car. If I wanted to track, then I will go to tracking, and then all is sometimes a good option if you're recording a video and there's a lot of movement in the scene, you're doing a vlog and people are coming in and the focusing is moving all throughout the frame, then I would select wide. But that's just the general standpoint on that. When you go to single point 2, you do get an option to select a 9x13 or a 17x25 grid. Essentially, this is going to be how many autofocus points you're going to be able to select on the back display. I normally set this to 117 because it's a lot of points if you're using the joystick and I'm trying to shoot, say I'm shooting portraits inside the studio. I don't want to have to go through the entire grid, the entire 17x25 grid. It's a lot of autofocusing points. I'd rather do 9x13. Pre-autofocus is basically the camera engages autofocus before you actually have to press the shutter. This is something that definitely drains battery life, and the camera's always going to be autofocusing. I haven't found a particular use case where I'd want to use pre-autofocus. It may be a good option if you're shooting sports and action and you want to have the camera be engaging focus before you have to press the shutter so that you're already halfway there or you're very close. But for me, I haven't really found a particular use case where I've seen that's been totally necessary. Your AF illuminator is going to determine whether you want the autofocus illuminator to be on and off. The AF illuminator basically puts out a little bit of a light that helps you focus in low light situations. You could use a phone for that situation as well, but the AF illuminator just works in conjunction with the camera to be able to focus just very briefly. Face and eye detection settings, I always have this on, and I also leave it at eye auto. The reason because as you're moving throughout the frame, depending on where my head turns, this is my dominant eye to the camera now, but this is my dominant eye to the camera if I'm turning this way. And I want the camera to recognize that, so I just leave it at eye auto. And this is also applicable if I'm shooting portraits and I'm shooting fashion beauty. It's the same exact process. I don't want it to just specifically focus on a set eye. All the cameras that have face and eye detection that have come out since 2019, when this really started hitting market, it's been great. It's been a great feature. The manufacturers that have this particular feature have been refining it over the last 2.5 years. So I haven't found a reason why I would need to specify left or right eye specifically. You can turn off eye detection if you want and you want to just focus on faces, but I don't recommend doing that. AF plus manual focus. This is essentially a feature that allows you to adjust the focus collar on a manual focus ring like that I have here with the 10-24. It allows you to adjust the manual focus so you can fine tune your autofocus if you want to. If you're shooting like a macro scene or something like that, you're shooting flowers and it's not quite getting you exactly where you want to focus, AF plus MF is what you're going to be able to turn on to be able to engage that. Otherwise, this focus ring doesn't do anything when you're doing autofocus, so keep that in mind. MF assist, these are your manual focus assist tools. Basically, this is going to be focus peaking, which is going to be a red highlight or yellow or blue highlight around things that are in focus. And then you also have the focus check, and you have focus magnification as well. That's in one of those options. These are just manual focusing aids. Manual focusing, for the most part, is not going to be a beginner's oriented thing. So if you're using manual focus, please turn on these options so you can actually see various aids on the back of the screen. Focus check is kind of it's just another manual focus aid. I'm not going to cover that one as well, but if you're using manual focus check, manual focus assist, magnification, peaking, those are all great options. Interlock spot, auto exposure in focus area. Essentially what happens if you have this enabled, and I do recommend this, the camera is going to actually expose, and it's going to give you the exposure meter from -3 to +3. It's going to give you the exposure based on where you're actually autofocusing. And this is a great tool if you're shooting portraits because you want the face to be evenly exposed. You don't want it to be too bright or too dark. You don't want the highlights to be blowing out, and you don't want to be losing detail. If you have this option turned on, it's actually going to use that as its gauge for doing auto exposure, and I think that's a great option. This is release and focus priority is basically just setting whether the camera should focus on focusing more or just taking the photo. For me, I always prioritize focus because it doesn't make any sense if the camera's going to know that it's going to be out of focus for it to capture an out of focus shot. So I always put this to focus on every single camera. Your touchscreen, you can configure to do touch shots, so you can take a photo as soon as you tap. You can autofocus as soon as you tap, or you can select an autofocusing area as soon as you tap. That's just going to be personal preference. Any of those options work great. Let's move into the next menu, which is going to be your shooting menu. Here is where you're going to find the advanced functionality that the X-T200 provides. These include changing scene selections, your advanced filters, the clarity filter, time-lapse, the time-lapse movie function, auto exposure and film simulation bracketing, and the light trail mode. I'm not going to go through these specifically. These are just options that are very much dependent on what you're shooting. For example, if you want to use some of the advanced filters and do like multi-exposures or something, or you want to use time-lapse and use the intervalometer and film simulation and auto exposure bracketing, these are more advanced functionality. Same thing with the self-timer. The self-timer is great if you're putting the camera to do a long exposure and it's on a tripod and you want to do 5 seconds so that you don't have any shake. That's just an option, or you're taking a group selfie, you can configure that if you'd like. Shutter type, electronic versus mechanical shutter. I always set this to mechanical shutter. I've been experimenting a little bit between mechanical and electronic to see if there's a huge difference in image quality. Typically when you go to electronic shutter, there's the camera could shoot faster. You get a better burst rate of maybe closer to 20 frames per second because the camera is not actually chomping down on the shutter every single time. It's just using the sensor readout and just stopping, just pausing and capturing the signal right there. Yeah, the electronic shutter versus mechanical shutter. Electronic shutter is also a great option if you don't want to introduce wear on your shutter. It's just going to use the electronics that are already happening. The sensor's already going to be on. It's already going to be reading the data. So there's nothing you could do about that. But the mechanical shutter, if you turn that off, it can help your sensor, your longevity of your camera. ISO is just going to allow you to change the brightness and the sensitivity of the camera. Mount adapter settings. Essentially, this is for if you're using other Fujinon lenses. Typically, the camera recognizes this by default, but you can change the mount adapter and configure some of the focal length and distortion and some of the correction to compensate for lens anomalies is basically what this is doing. This is a very advanced functionality if you want to do micro adjustments to your lenses, not in terms of focus, but in terms of distortion and chromatic aberration, fringing, these kind of things. You can fix some of that stuff in camera, and the mount adapter settings is how you go about doing that. Touch zoom, you can enable that if you have a compatible lens. Wireless communication settings is how you actually connect this camera wirelessly. And here you can actually, it pops up a prompt for you to connect to the Fujifilm Camera Remote app. But I'm not going to connect to my iPad right now. So let's go back into the main menu. And let's scroll down. Here are your flash settings. The Fujifilm X-T200 does have a built-in flash. You can actually do some flash compensation, change the flash mode, and red eye removal. I just leave those as default. I don't actually use the built-in flash on the Fujifilm X-T200, so I leave those as default. But if you're using the built-in flash, you can configure it to do fill flash or red eye removal or slow speed sync, these kind of things, and to help out. Now in the video menu, this is going to be very much dependent if you want to record in 4K. But here you have your resolutions and your frame rates. For me, I shoot in full HD, 24 frames per second. The HDR movie mode is basically going to be a way for you to, if you're shooting outdoors, it's going to help the camera kind of flatten out the image. So your highlights aren't going to be as high and your shadows are not going to be as deep. So you're going to get more rich and more contrasty, but more evenly balanced footage, which is called HDR. It does that in camera, and you can set the frame rate here. If you want to do that, I would just do 1080p, 24 frames per second. Digital gimbal and the digital image stabilization, those apply basically electronic stabilization to smooth out handshake when you're filming handheld. If you want to see this in action, you can check out our Fujifilm X-T200 vlog test. You can see these parameters in action. Works really well. I wasn't using a stabilized lens for that particular video, and the digital gimbal and the electronic stabilization works great. So if you're in a situation where you don't have a stabilized lens, I would definitely say come into this video menu and turn on the digital gimbal and the digital image stabilization. Of note, the digital gimbal doesn't work. I don't think it works in 4K. Digital image stabilization also applies a crop and only works in 1080p because it needs the extra resolution. Full HD high-speed recording is how you can get full HD 120 frames per second video in camera. You can set basically how it downsamples to 30 frames per second or 24 frames per second in that menu. And then countdown recording is if you want the camera to basically wait a set amount of time before you actually start recording. This is a great option if you're doing pieces of camera like I am for this YouTube video, and you're just like, okay, let me like set up my lighting and, you know, get seated. You don't want it to be rolling at that time. So essentially that will fix that. The focus mode for video, I always set this continuous autofocus, and then the movie AF, you can set this, I set this to multi. Essentially what this is doing is that you're configuring how the camera is going to focus in video if you're using continuous autofocus. If you set it to multi, it's going to look at and analyze the entire scene essentially, and then basically focus on people, subject, face, and eye detection. If that's enabled, it's going to prioritize that first. Area is going to prioritize a certain area in the frame, in which you can set. But I always do multi, and I use face and eye detection that we configured earlier in the AF MF settings. Here you're going to be able to change your ISO, your HDMI output inflow display, which is a clean HDMI if you want to do live streaming or connect this to an external recorder or monitor. That's the setting that you would change. 4K movie, you can change this to either record internally to the SD card or externally to basically an external monitor. HDMI record control, this is also another external monitor functionality. And then your audio setting, here you can find basically information detailing if you connect an external microphone to the camera, how you're going to be able to set the levels, wind cut filter, various other filters, your headphone output if you connect your headphones as well, and you can configure all of those settings in that particular area. The microphone and release setting, this is if you're going to actually use an external release, something that you connect via USB-C, or actually in the microphone input in this case, but you connect it to the camera and you can actually press a button and it triggers a shutter remotely, and that in some cases you can probably get 30, 50, 100 feet of a shutter release. You can be very, very far away from the camera. You can definitely find some very long cables on that one. And it allows you to remotely trigger the camera, so you can be back at camp and you can do astrophotography and you can be warm while the camera is just snapping away, or you can do a time lapse. This is basically the setting is how you configure whether it's going to be a microphone or it's going to be an external shutter release. And the last menu is going to be our setup page, your user settings. This is going to allow you to format, set up your My menu, your time and date information, your sound and flash, whether you want the camera to make sound, and then your resetting right here in your sensor cleaning. These are all things that you use periodically as you kind of use the X-T200. If you want to use the My menu, which is right down here, you can configure the My menu. My menu is definitely a great option. You can add all your favorite menu items to a same page. It just makes it a lot more straightforward for you to find your most used settings. Sound setup is going to be your AF beep, your self timer, your operational controls, if you're using electronic shutter, if it plays a sound, your playback volume. These are all things that you can configure to taste. Screen setup, this is going to be your EVF color, brightness, and then also your rare LCD color and brightness. Preview exposure in manual mode. This basically configures, this is actually a setting that I would encourage you to turn on, because if you turn this off, the camera is automatically going to change the exposure to make sure that it's evenly exposed, which is good depending on what you're doing. But if you want to see the exposure in real time, then this is the setting that you would enable to do that. Natural live view is basically like, it shows you more of like a natural, like almost like a flat profile that doesn't really get impacted by the film simulations that I've seen. It gives you a better representation of what the raw files look like without any edits or any film simulations attached. It's been something I've been playing around with. It's helpful when you're framing, because sometimes there's a discrepancy between what you see in the EVF and then what you actually see in playback, and Natural Live View seems to be fixing that particular issue. Framing guidelines, if you want to have grids or grid lines. Auto rotate in playback if you want the pictures to rotate when you're actually rotating the camera. You can change your focusing scale from meters or feet depending on your preference there. You can also customize the display if you want to level your distance, your histogram, among other things, battery level, mic level. I just leave these as default. I change these as needed as I kind of go along depending on what I want to see. Large indicators in the EVF, these make the icons bigger. Same thing with here on the LCD. These make the icons on the LCD bigger that you'll see down here on the bottom. You'll see a bunch of icons there. It just makes those icons bigger. Large indicators in display setting. These are the things over here on this side. You can actually, you can change those as well. You can customize that. I leave those as default though, personally. Button and dial settings. This is how you actually configure some of the customizable buttons on the X-T200. Your focus lever. You can change. I don't play around with that particular one. This is your quick menu. If you want to customize your quick menu, here's the quick menu on screen right now. You can customize that. I customize that. That's a very specific thing that I customize. This is how you're going to change your function buttons. Two are right here, and then you can actually do the touch function buttons, which actually apply right here. You can do the touch function buttons as well. These are just all customizable for parameters. Shoot without lens, if you want to do that. You can change your focusing ring to make it clockwise or counterclockwise. So if you want to focus in that way, or you want to focus in this way. And your touchscreen settings, you can do double tap and you can configure that. These are just customizable settings. Power management. The only thing that is of note here is I don't turn on auto power off, and I also put the performance to high performance. This is a particular issue on the X-T200 more so than an XT, or this is actually a huge issue on the XS10 more so than the X-T200. If you don't put this in high performance, what happens is that after a certain amount of time, basically the camera like reduces its performance, and that you'll see that as basically lag on the rear LCD. It's usually an issue when you're shooting in lower light scenes, usually around ISO 3200 or higher. And you'll start to see a lag. The camera's basically reducing some of its internal processing to preserve some of the battery life. But if you do want maximum battery life, say your battery's low, I would come in here and change the performance economy and take that little bit of a latency and the reduced, maybe the reduced viewfinder refresh rate in some cases. May not happen with this camera, but that's usually what happens. If you're in a situation where you want to maximize your battery life, then you would come in here and you change that from high performance to economy. Save data setup is going to be determining how you want the file numbering and organization on how the camera's basically stamping its files. You can edit the file name if you want. Instead of it being DSFC, DFCF, you can change it to whatever you want. That's a customizable personal preference kind of thing. And then your connection settings. I went through this when I was actually doing the connection video on the X-T200 on how to connect it to an iPhone or an Android device. Basically in here is how you connect various devices. You connect it to a smartphone. You can also connect it to a computer for auto saving. And you can also do basically USB image transfer settings. You can turn that on and off. I just leave that on by default. And there's some other general settings in here. Resizing for smartphone, geotagging if you'd like to do geotagging, and then your Bluetooth settings were right there. But those are the general settings, walking through those. I will put the camera over into the movie mode right now as well. Let me come out, and there are a little bit of differences there, we'll kind of go through that. So I'll put it in the actual movie mode and we'll go back in. It does kind of change some of the image quality settings. But what it really changes though is the video settings down here. For example, the HDR movie, and it would also enable the digital stabilization. Those options, I don't have a lens attached, so that's probably why that's not actually available for use. But those are the settings that do come up. And now all this other stuff is basically the same. So we've covered the full menu. I've covered actually the vast majority of the settings. I thought I was going to skip more settings than I actually ended up skipping. But if you have any comments, questions, or concerns, or feel like I've overlooked something over the course of this video, please let me know down below. Also, while you're down in the description box down below, we've launched a new brand called pxpresets.com. PX Presets is going to be your next one and only stop for Lightroom presets until we launch Photoshop and other platform presets. But here you can find both desktop and mobile presets to get you started in a variety of different mediums more powerfully and upgrade your imaging and take your images to the next level. That link to pxpresets.com will be in the description box down below. Please check that out if you're in the market for some exciting Lightroom presets. But until next time, my friends, I've been your host, Devaun Lennox. I will see you in the next video.